Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. Today we have a very special guest. Today we have on David Samson. He's an associate professor of evolutionary anthropology at the University of Toronto and director of the Sleep and Human Evolution Lab, SHEL. David's research has been internationally profiled in venues such as the BBC, Time, the New York Times, the Smithsonian, CBC, NPR, and National Geographic. He's also part of the Mental Immunity Project and CIRCE, which aim to advance and apply the science of mental immunity to inoculate minds against misinformation. And his new book, available now, is called Our Tribal Future: How to Channel Our Foundational Human Instincts into a Force for Good. Welcome, David. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, guys. The Seize the Moment podcast. What a beautiful name for a podcast. I love it.
I love it. Thank you so much. And by the way, just before we begin, it was super random too. So if you see it, Alan has we have on the background, like it's a bunch of just words and stuff. So literally we're sitting here one day and we're like, oh, what should our title, our podcast title be? Oh, Seize the Moment. I was like, we should make it.
It was literally his idea. Yeah, he's looking at that poster and he's like, oh, yeah, wait, what should it be? And then all of a sudden he sees it behind my head. He's like, oh. Yeah.
That is seriously, that's the power of cues in one's local environment to shape cognition. And it's which may be something we talk about today with tribal signaling. So it'll be fun.
Oh, we're definitely going to get into that. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a passage from David's book. David wrote, "Tribalism is governed by a force so motivationally powerful that it predicts more of your behavior than your race, class, nationality, or religion. The formal analysis of this incredible phenomenon has only just begun, but the emerging science reveals that these factors are mere subjugates to our primal instinct to be a factor of a tribe. This quote-unquote tribal drive is an ancient adaptation that has been a prerequisite for survival for 99.9% of our species' evolutionary history. It is a critical piece of cognitive machinery honed by millions of years of evolution that gave us the ability to navigate both cooperatively and competitively increasingly complex social landscapes. But now that our species spans millions, billions across the globe, does this adaptation continue to serve us, or is it a mismatch to its environment? In other words, what happens when humans become either tribal-less or destructively consumed by tribalism?" So I actually want to start off with what people are going to probably think of as a very silly example, but I think it's a very good one. So if David, you follow professional wrestling at all, I don't know if you ever have.
I have not only do I follow it. In high school, I've been to a couple live events. I grew up, we moved from Canada to Indiana when I was 12. And to properly tribal signal my coalitionary alliances, if you were a dude growing up in Indiana, you needed to watch professional wrestling. So yes, I have been to a couple live events.
Okay, I love that. So this is going to be my example. So in the history of professional wrestling, and especially now, the most popular storyline is one called the Bloodline. And so the reason, the reason why the Bloodline storyline has been so popular is because it's a storyline about a family tribe. And so in the Polynesian community, I mean, they're very tribal in the sense that I don't want to, because I was going to say primitive, but it's not the right term. They're very tribal in the sense of they have very tight-knit communities. And so the Bloodline storyline has been super popular in the sense that you have like a tribal chief, who's obviously the Roman Reigns character. Then you have the Usos, who are kind of like the backups. And then you have sort of the wise man and Paul Heyman. So what's so interesting is that if you're looking at just popularity and the most popular wrestling storylines in the history of just wrestling, just history and wrestling storylines, what you're seeing is that for the most part, it's not successful individuals that become popular. It's actually successful, what they call stables in wrestling terminology. So successful factions and groups. But obviously now going into the Bloodline has become the most successful. What I mean, arguably, and I would say pretty, if you look at the data, just based on the numerics of like how much people watch, how much their clothes and merch sells, it's the Bloodline, right? So the Bloodline storyline has been the most famous and the most popular one. And it seems to be because of the tribal aspect of it. Again, the tribal chief and the kind of the minions that sort of follow him around. So can we get into that? So why is it that you think that sort of not only just in wrestling, the tribalism is so popular, but just in general, like why are we geared toward aspects of movies, television, in this case, obviously professional wrestling, that are actually, about tribes and how tribes work and how hierarchies work? Chimp Empire, another example on Netflix, super popular show, all about tribalism.
And the tribe drive.
Yeah.
Right. And the tribe. Man, you guys are giving me a lot to unpack there with the opening question. Just as an interesting aside, right off the bat, Roman Reigns, so one of my best friends, in fact, part of our closest in-group, one of my best friends is actually training Roman Reigns, like actual real life tribe, his group.
Wow.
He does Viking reenactment and is actually sword training him because my best friend's a highly qualified sword instructor.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, in a couple months, I think at the end of September, we're going to one of these events together. So, and Roman's reading the book, Our Tribal Future. So
what? That's very cool. That is very cool.
It is pretty cool. And he's already like 2/3 the way through the book. And we're going to talk about how we can leverage the science of it so he can improve his own kith and kin and tribal group. Anyway, I was blown away by the fact that you opened up with that particular anecdote.
Right?
Yeah. So, all right, I think the way to approach this is just to start with, well, maybe let's just go ahead and define what a tribe is, because you used it in several different contexts there, and they all are intuitively tapping into the source of what a tribe is. But I think that for us to be scientists about this, we need an operationalized definition. And so my operationalized definition of a tribe is it's an intersubjective belief network that signals coalitionary alliance for the function of bootstrapping trust among strangers. Now that's a boatload, right? So basically what it is, if you were to boil it down anecdotally or more simply, it would be if you project authentic signals that you're part of a team and they're received, you gain all the rights and privileges of that team. It's almost kind of like a secret society, if you will, except in plain sight, right? And all the signals that we are constantly emitting and receiving are part of the complex algorithm that under the hood, we either are more apt to cooperate with somebody, a stranger we've never met, or to not cooperate. And so literally this is so strong a drive that our tribal identity alters our view of the world, like the way we perceive the world. In fact, every idea we're going to discuss now will in large part be accepted or denied based on our pre-existing identities and their associated beliefs. Like that's how powerful this thing is. Maybe one way to get at this and to disentangle this, because as you noted through reading the opening part of the book there, we're talking about evolutionary history. We're talking about deep time. And for us to wrap our heads around how much actual time we're talking about that this trait has evolved, I think it'd be useful to bring in a metaphor or an analogy. We're going to use a movie. So we're going to call it the human movie, okay? The average movie is about 100 minutes long. So we're going to boil down 1.8 million years of human evolution into a 100-minute movie, okay? Minute 1, something really cool happens. The opening is pretty exciting. You have Australopithecines, who were our basically very chimp-like forebears, and they evolved in a gallery forest. Then we split off, and these Australopithecines were basically chimpanzees from the waist up, and they could walk bipedally waist down. By the time we get to the ground, something really unique happens. We double down on a eusocial strategy. We start living in camps. So in minute 1, something really important happens. We start living in camps. The camps are basically 20 to 30 adults, and you're sharing the objectives of survival and reproduction with 20 to 30 different people, okay? There is no such, there's no nuclear family. Like the smallest unit is the camp. So in minute 1, that's how we figure out how to stay safe on the ground and start exploiting the savanna resources in East Africa 1.8 million years ago, minute 1 of the movie. Now it gets pretty boring after that innovation. You need a David Attenborough to spice up the narration, because for 84 minutes, it's kind of the same. We see an increase in brain size a little bit, but at 84 minutes, then something really interesting happens. You start seeing human groups transcending their home ranges, meaning you start seeing in the paleoanthropological record bits and pieces of group identifying signatures like ochre on a specific kind of obsidian tool that can only be found in one location, but you're finding them really far away from their source location. And so what this indicates is that if we're trying to figure out when this tribe drive was getting bootstrapped into the human mind, it would probably be around minute 84, which is about 300,000 years ago. Incidentally, guys, this is when Homo sapiens evolve onto the scene. And I don't think this is by chance. I think the fact that Homo sapiens are a symbolically driven species, we're obsessed with symbols, and our perception of symbols is totally innate. And I think these two things happened at the same time, because the value proposition here is once you start signaling on the group of a larger and larger scale, you're saying when you emit those signals, the value prop there is that if you mess with me, you're not just messing with me, you're messing with everyone in this collective. And that meant enhanced survival, reproduction, and out competing other groups that didn't have this signal. So that's minute 84. And then things kind of slowly progress. They build and build and build. With 1 minute left in the movie, the human movie, it becomes a radical science fiction film. Like it gets insane. So with 1 minute left, you have our species outcompeting Neanderthals. We become the sole inheritors of the earth compared to every other hominid. There have been other human-like things running around all over the world for the entirety of the story. We become the dominant one. We outcompete Neanderthals. And I think it's because we had the capacity to project coalitionary alliances and to leverage the tribe drive and symbols in a way that Neanderthals and other hominids didn't. So that's 1 minute left. With 30 seconds left, we become sedentary, right? We start basically domesticating and mastering, literally by enslaving plants and animals, so that we had a 24/7 refrigerator of calories, right? But then coalitions became even more important because you have a bunch of calories in one spot that unless you defend that spot, you're going to get eaten. Like literally everyone's just going to get eaten alive by groups that are much better at projecting coalitionary alliance. Then with 10 seconds left, you have writing being innovated because you've got these really big coalescing groups of about 1 million or 2 more people. With 5 seconds after that, you have the innovations of big gods, moralizing religions. And we can very clearly see the moralizing God hypothesis is fascinating. You can very clearly see that it's population density that is the precursor to really big monotheistic moralizing gods, because that's how you get 1 million people to cooperate. You get a priest class and you're like, look, if this is our intersubjective belief network and you're gonna buy into it by pen or sword, you're gonna buy into it, because if you don't, we'll get outcompeted by another group.
Right. Wow.
Now, here's where it gets super exciting when we talk about the last final seconds here. And it really sets us up to understand what the hell is going on right now. This is where mismatch comes in, because with about a second left, we see in North America, in a place called Levittown, the nuclear family being innovated and the suburb being created. This is like the McDonald's of social patterns, right? It's like nothing we had ever seen before. 99.5 minutes of the movie, we start becoming isolated, lonely, and alone on a societal level at scale. So we have a massive mismatch there between the camp life in minute 1 and the kinds of lives we're living on a day-to-day. And then with milliseconds left, you, for the first time, boot up 5 billion people with all the thousands of associated tribes online, throw them onto Twitter or X, and then you wonder why we're in a state of absolute chaos. And it helps just contextualize the fact that before this moment, throughout the most of the human movie, you might, as a tribe member, meet 2 or 3 other tribes in the history of your tribe. Now we've got thousands of them interacting in highly complex and dynamic ways, and that's the close of the movie. And so here we have a setup for why things are in a state that they are, because we're in a state of evolutionary mismatch. That is, we evolved for how things were, not how things are. And that's one of the cornerstones of the book, the opening of the book especially. I talk about the science of evolutionary mismatch and the consequences of it for our species. That was a lot. So you guys were super patient. I appreciated that. You let me talk about the human movie, but I hope it's useful.
Yeah, that was really great.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. No, as far as sort of putting it into context, how we developed tribes and where we are now, it's actually very interesting to then think about, well, still in many aspects, we do still act tribally, right? There is this mismatch that's going on. Yes, we are isolated, but we have groups maybe online or different sorts of social groups still that maybe we interact with and sort of get into that tribalist sort of mindset, right? Especially, let's say, politically, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess maybe this is a good point to maybe start to ask, what are sort of the negative aspects of tribalism? So that maybe we could understand that, and then maybe then understand what are the benefits of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think it's important to realize that actually the core innovation here was one that was meant to increase and augment our capacity to cooperate. And that, so when we say the word tribalism in a modern context, we often mean it in a negative way, right? Mm-hmm. We're like, oh, people are acting tribal. And actually, I do think that, so there's a difference between a tribe and tribalism. Tribalism is kind of like all the other bins of bad isms. It's the belief that your coalitionary alliance is somehow inherently superior than other coalitionary alliances. And so you can actually look at racism as being a subcategory of what the core root trait is, in a way, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're playing with here. But we have to, it's such a powerful thing, because at its core, it was evolved to augment cooperation at scale. The issue is, the tension point is, once you define that in-group and you create that intersubjective belief network saying, hey, if you have like this paint on your face and this feather in your vest, I know you're from X tribe, right? Mm-hmm. And so that means I can begin cooperating with you and others that I've never met before at scale. But it also means if you don't, you are subject to perhaps even the worst elements of human behavior. You're an outgroup, because as soon as you make a circle, you also make the outside of the circle.
Right.
And so this trait meant that if you're aware of the signals in your environment, you can massively scale cooperation beyond what we were able to do before. Well, the oldest trait that allowed us to scale cooperation was kin selection. That goes back 1 billion years. Basically, mm-hmm. This is the idea that if you have an organism in your environment that shares genes, the more genes they share, the more likely you are to invest in them and cooperate, right? Mm-hmm. And then you brought up chimpanzees just a moment ago. They're one of maybe a dozen species on the planet that, relatively recent, evolutionarily speaking, evolved friendship. Mm. The thing with friendship is you've got to be able to have a big, needy brain that can record a ledger of record of your interactions, your past interactions, and how those felt in terms of like morally good, morally bad. And only about a dozen or so species have that really, really specifically recorded that they can do that. Mm-hmm. So when humans innovated the tribe as a cognitive mechanism, it was how to scale trust at scale. To get beyond our cognitive limitation. I'm sure you guys are familiar with the Dunbar's number.
Yeah, we used to live in tribes of 50, 100, 150 people, and we could only hold that many people maybe in our mind. But now we have way bigger villages scale. Or societal systems at scale.
Yeah, so this is fascinating research by Robert Dunbar. It shows how groups effectiveness scales. And 150 seems to be like a hard limit for deep relationships. So we have about the average human being, because of computational channel capacity in our brain, the average human being has about 100 to 150 deep relationships. And so this was, when we innovated tribes and tribalism, this was a way it was like a cheat sheet, a heuristic to burst beyond that limitation and start cooperating at scale. But then you get really bad things, because when you don't signal authentically as part of someone's coalitionary alliance, that's when bad things can happen. And it can happen to the point where you get some of humanity's worst behaviors, like dehumanization and genocide.
Yeah. You know what's so interesting? When I was thinking about it, and I was kind of going through the book and going through your work, I was thinking about, so we had David Myers on the podcast. I'm sure you know who he is, social psychologist, right? So the Lake Wabagan effect. So yeah, David Myers argues, and he and I had a conversation about this, I remember, because so I write a lot about pride and self-esteem. And so this was something that I didn't necessarily see, but when I read his book, I was like, oh, that was a kind of take on it that I didn't really consider. So with David pretty much would argue is he would say, look, even though the research does say that we need pride and we obviously need to feel good about ourselves, I mean, ultimately speaking, what's going to happen is we're going to become very tribal. So if you think about, the kind of the negative of it, and so what happens is you feel good about yourself, but then that's also in comparison to something or somebody else. And inherently, when one tribe feels like, let's say if you win something, let's say you're a football team and you just won the Super Bowl. I mean, automatically you're going to feel like you're better than the team you beat, obviously. So
and it's going to have physiological effects. Your testosterone profile changes. Your all these core hormonal variants are going to actually change on the basis of your imaginary identity. This illusory identity being associating yourself with a social, what's called a social self.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah,
I didn't mean to interrupt there. Yeah.
No, it's okay. It's okay. But yeah. So, right. And so what's so interesting about that is that even though on the one hand, we do need to feel good about ourselves and we do need to feel like we're part of the in group, right? So we know, again, so we need self-esteem. We know that being ostracized really like deeply, profoundly hurts us. And, again, talk about physiological effects. I mean, obviously we become severely depressed, etc. Right. So, and on the one hand, so this isn't something I've really been able to figure out. And I mean, also, who am I? But I haven't really been able to figure out a way to kind of square the two, where on the one hand, we desperately need pride and we need to feel like we're a part of some, I would say, higher in terms of the social hierarchy, some in group that's of pretty notable status, right? And we had also on Chuck Thompson, who talked about status, and he says pretty much status is inherent to being human. He's like, look, man, we really can't overcome it, right? But then, when we think about the negatives of it, okay, and this is like why David would say that we probably need to do away with it, is because again, automatically when we compare, we automatically devalue. So I guess, and this is going to be such a hard question to ask, but I do want to know your thoughts on it. So how do we kind of make sense of the fact that, yes, on the one hand, we do need to feel like we're a part of a community. We do need to feel like that community matters and is important. But on the other hand, like, it causes so much discord and obviously and violence. I mean, it can literally even lead to violence. If you look at even like something stupid like sports rivalries. I mean, most of the time they don't become it doesn't become severely bad. But I mean, there are times where people literally kill each other over that stuff.
Yeah. So what's really, you hinted at how challenging this topic is. What's really challenging about this is that, I mean, we're talking about ancient brain structures here, like the anterior cingulate cortex. This is the part of the brain that it's very close to the limbic system, but it's basically, it determines your social self. And so this is what identity does. If you and I grow a relationship over time, then the anterior cingulate cortex is going to start associating your pain or your success and your happiness as identical to my own. Just so much so that if you were to hook up a fMRI to somebody in a kitchen and they're a loved one and they cut their finger while you're watching them and they're bleeding out and they say, ow, the anterior cingulate cortex is going to light up in both individuals. And it's going to, that ACC is going to be like the thing, that driving force when somebody you love is in pain, that thing that where before it's not conscious, you're just over there and you're helping them. It's because it's literally tricking you into thinking that social other is you. That's what it's doing. And so the key here, I think, is to recognize that that is actually a superpower, because it's the source of one of our greatest capacities as humans, as Homo sapiens, to show empathy and sympathy. The issue is, the moral issue we're trying to get to is that it's not a moral problem, it's an energy problem, because it's extremely neurophysiologically expensive to enact these things at scale. So if you were to see a stranger in the same situation doing the exact same activities and they cut their finger, it doesn't light up, right? And so this is just, it's an energy problem. It's not a morality problem. It's that there are just energy and capacity limitations to the human brain. And we have to be conscious of these things. And I think maybe one way forward is to actually leverage them in the sense that, so I think right now, one of the key ways we could move forward is by reweighting our identities. This is something I discussed in the very last part of the book, the last chapter. So this is pretty scary stuff, guys. I taught my summer course all on this particular topic. I called it the trust paradox, but one of the sources for the class was our tribal future. And I challenged the class to rank their identity as they would a social psychologist. So you ask somebody, how proud are you to identify with this group? And then you ask them to list all the groups they identify with, and then they get a Likert scale, right? They're not very likely to be proud of identifying with the group, or they're very strongly associated with the group. Then you get that scale. And then I asked them, because we had gone through the definition of tribe at this point, I asked them to list by it, which of these groups are tribal groups, meaning which ones transcend Dunbar's number. Which one of these identity groups are so big that you couldn't know everybody in the group. And it was pretty terrifying to see that a lot of students, like a disconcerting number of students, only had tribal identities, meaning they identified as, say, a Democrat or a Republican, as opposed to, say, my soccer team, right? Like face-to-face, where these things like the anterior cingulate cortex, you want those activating in those particular contexts. But now I think we have a situation where a lot of people are overweighting their identities, their identity stacks into tribal affiliations with these big mega super tribes that have very little to do with your day-to-day sense of well-being, health, all these things. That's going to be governed by your face-to-face relationships in a much more powerful and profound way. And so my challenge to my students was, guys, reweight your identities. It's fine, identify with a political party. That's okay. Be politically active. That's okay. But don't weight so much of your energy into it that your sense of wellness and your sense of your health are actually connected to them, because these are not real things. They're illusory things. The real things are the identity groups that you have that are face-to-face, and they're much more ancient, like the camp, right? The camp was minute one in our evolutionary narrative of the movie. Band levels, so your neighborhood, your community, that's the stuff we should be weighting and throwing all our identity energies into to help us sort of keep away from the dangers of this stuff at scale.
What's very fascinating to me, though, is that how many of your students actually put the weight of their identity into these super tribes, right? Now, this is going to sound like a really stupid or maybe obvious sort of question to ask, but what do you think is going on there that's making them want to pick these super tribes? Is it just the sheer mass of people that happen to be part of that group, therefore it just conveys that status to them?
Yeah, as opposed to like in groups that they're normally around.
Yeah. So I think it's twofold. It's a two-front war where, because of, remember, the McDonald's social pattern that we have of like a network, a nuclear family, because of growing up in these essentially socially blunted groups, we haven't had direct access to those core group level identities that most of our ancestors did for 99.5 minutes of the movie. So I think we've and you can see it in the growth and development patterns of adolescents now, and the stats that are coming out are absolutely they're really scary stuff. Like suicidal ideation is now up to 10% in adolescents who are in college. 50% of kids in college now they basically are saying that they feel a sense of hopelessness daily, that they don't want to go on. And that's doubled since 2009. And I wonder if you just plot these kids, or even not even just these kids, but like, say, kids who go on shooting sprees or suicide, the really bad epidemic of school shootings that we have. I wonder what would happen. I mean, you can't test this, but like, what if you plopped that kid from that typically like isolated, lonely environment they developed in? What if you put them in a hunter-gatherer tribe and then see what they look like at the same age? Just run that experiment. And my gut, guys, is that they would be a pretty well-adjusted human being and like a pretty decent human being. And that's how powerful this is. So you've got that element that we're under-socialized at the community level. And then at the big scale level, at the super tribal level, right? Because the average Homo sapien tribe for 99.5 minutes of the human movie was about 1,500 people. That's like your organic grassroots tribe, right? Small scale tribe. We're probably built to live and dwell into one of those tribes. But now we have super tribes it's necessitated by the fact that we need to live in nation states to project power and not be murdered like the 20th century taught us, right? If you don't project power at scale, then you get in trouble. You get mowed over by other groups. So yeah. I'll just say, I'll round out one final point here is that what I think we've got going on here is weaponized tribalism, political tribalism, to the point where in the United States, now only 4% of marriages are intermarried between Democrat and Republican. Mm-hmm. So like back in the 60s and 70s, the big moral push was like, hey guys, we can marry interracially. And now it's not a issue statistically. But marrying across political party is totally a tribal issue. When you look at the House of Representatives and their voting patterns over the past 60 years, it was this, if you were to imagine them as source populations interbreeding, you see all this healthy interbreeding between like the source populations of ideas. And now it's like two distinct balls that you would see if you were predicting a speciation event, like two different species are being made. Right. So anyway, it's crazy.
Yeah, so I just want to kind of pick up on the idea of these of the super tribes. So what's so interesting about them, I think, is that there's a kind of so because it's so disparate and so kind of widely spread. And I'm actually going to go back to the example of Roman Reigns and Bloodline.
Nice.
So yeah. So what I think about it is that so like let's say being a Democrat. So being a Democrat, there's a set of values contained within it. So let's say if I were in a tribe of Democrats, let's say Alan and I had a tribe of Democrats, right? Let's say we were in some case like the Bloodline. Right. So the bloodline is a great kind of I guess example of corruption in tribes. So when you're so close to somebody, right? So this is what I love about the kind of Roman Reigns character is that he has no values. I mean, he essentially he's a Machiavellian, right? To the extreme, to the core. And so he keeps and maintains power right through kind of any means necessary. And what you get like in the Uso characters where like Jimmy also kind of doesn't have many values. And then like Jay, you could kind of see that he fluctuates back and forth. Sometimes he feels like he does, sometimes he doesn't. So when you have like these super tribes like the Democrats, what I actually like about it is that you have values that connect people, from across let's say across the pond or whatever, from different parts of even the world. I mean, there are people even in other countries that would say like, yeah, I'm a Democrat, even though they don't have that party system there. But what's so interesting, again, is going back to the idea of like tribalism and this, again, going back to the bloodline, is that it's so easy to corrupt. So when you're saying that, I'm in this small tribe of, let's say, and, going back to the example, it's about like 6 people or whatever it is, right? It's easy to say, well, I'm willing to do anything to gain the approval of, the tribal chief or even the wise man and the Paul Heyman character. But when you identify with something like, as let's say, I could even say Republicans. This is not. I'm not even getting into what's better, right? Let's say I identify. No. Let's say I'll identify as a Republican, right? And then I would say, okay, well, the thing is, so because I'm not in a specific like core tribe of Republicanism, meaning there's no like head tribal chief of Republicanism. Therefore, I can say that these are going to be my core values, whether I'm in Utah, whether I'm in Colorado, whether I'm in New York, wherever, right? So there's not such a deep connection. Meaning, maybe, I mean, even though you can argue that yes, day to day we probably relate more so to the people who are, let's say in my case, Republicans now, I would say. But the point is to say that when it is kind of so disparate and it is kind of so widespread, the great thing about that is I think it's much less easy to corrupt. Whereas again, if you do have something like the bloodline, I mean, essentially the values kind of go out the window because again, everybody kind of appeases the tribal chief. And, since I mentioned chimp empire, this is what you kind of even see amongst like chimps, right? And you see this in some mammals. Well, what they do is because there's a hierarchy, they just appease the tribal leader. So they don't really care about, I mean, obviously animals are not really going to care per se, but like people don't really care about value. So yeah, so my question would be, do you think that it's possible that maybe even though yes, on the one hand we could say that sometimes it's a bad thing to have let's say distinct or distant kind of tribes that we feel a part of or distant people that we feel a part of, but also can there be maybe a kind of understanding that the in groups can be corrupted maybe just as easily?
Yeah, so the thing that springs to mind is that the phenomena you're talking about likely began when things started getting really scaling up in human population, maybe around in the human movie around a minute or 30 seconds left when we started being sedentary. When I was talking just a moment ago about these organic tribes of like 1,500, here is the reason why, and this is actually very hopeful, because basically in an organic tribe, it is less about physical dominance and coercion. It is more about what do you bring to the table as a leader? It's a prestige hierarchy. And that means that those who typically in small scale foragers, those who give the most of their time, energy, skill sets, those who demonstrate the most on brand tribal loyalty, like of the sacred values of that group, they naturally elevate to leadership positions in a way that once you had strong men come onto the scene because of the power they could distribute by rallying tens of thousands of dudes to be able to command militarily, that's really weird. That's not it's a very recent innovation in the human narrative. When you have things at the right scale, for example, a priest can corrupt, a Catholic priest can corrupt at scale, right? Like they can, or like a bishop can corrupt, or a pope can corrupt at scale. But a shaman can't corrupt at scale. If you are a dick as a shaman and you're using your powers like for like evil, like witchcraft, if you're using it to coerce others, you're in face-to-face relationships. They're going to kill you. You're going to get excommunicated. There's going to be a direct cost for you betraying the sacred values and trusts that they give you as a person of spiritual prominence in your group. The costs are real. And so Richard Wrangham, he has a book out that came out a few years ago. It's a beautiful book, The Goodness Paradox. And the main thrust of the argument here is that tyrants, specifically over evolutionary time, if you tried to dominate like a chimp, like chimpanzee raw power domination in a group, and you were going to be the tyrant of your group, it can work up to a point. Because at a certain point, not only will you be killed and excommunicated, it'll be, so you reduce the likelihood of vendetta killings, it'll be your brother or your father that kills you.
Wow.
And this is very systematic across small scale human populations. And over 1 million years, that basically selects out tyrants in the genome to the point where they are sort of generational aberrants and not the norm like they were when we were shared a common ancestor with the chimpanzee.
Oh, okay, wait. So now I have a kind of difficult question for you. Okay, but why is it that? So why is it that? So here's my thinking, right? Because that seems like a paradox. Because ultimately, the people who seem to want power are the narcissistic type tyrants, right? So they might do it through more benevolent means. But my thinking is, okay, for somebody to pursue power, for somebody good, let's say, to pursue power, it often seems like we have to kind of coax them into it, and they do it sort of begrudgingly.
Can I just add something to that?
Sure.
So obviously, in the end, we'll have the answer from you. But what it seems to me is that there's sort of the evolution of it is you first will have someone like a tyrant. It will evolve that in order to get society up to a certain level.
Right.
And then once actually we have certain needs met and things develop, eventually we wouldn't want that tyrant anymore. Things will get good enough where maybe then a different kind of leader would be needed. I didn't articulate that really greatly, but
so what I'm seeing there, I think that's true in a post-agrarian world. In a pre-agrarian world, which is the vast majority of our human evolution is a pre-agrarian world, I don't think that that's true, because what could happen is we were essentially nomadic, and we could take the little social shell we had built with our camps and our bands and our maybe our tribe, our single tribe. And if things got hot in that area, you could always just move it. And there was enough space until we got to the point about 9,000 years ago where things started, we got so good at mastering other genomes, both animal and plant, that we started encroaching everywhere. And then that's when tribalism really, its most foul forms, the political tribalism that we're talking about that's kind of scary, that's when it really went root to shoot, because it was those strong men, those coercive tyrants that could most masterfully manipulate our symbolic powers to get the most people to buy into the biggest intersubjective belief network, tribe, to leverage the collective watts of the entire group, to project raw energy and power into the environment so that they could take chain of custody over the resources in the environment, which is, by the way, the objective of every form of life that has ever lived since the dawn of history and prehistory. Right. So they just did it really freaking well. And let's make no mistake about it. Homo sapiens are apex predators. That's one of the reasons we are, and we didn't do it because of our claws or the size of our canines. or because we're strong, a chimp would eat us alive, literally in a fist fight. We did it because we could take symbols and use symbols to compound the collective energy of a group. And that is the core function of what a tribe does. Even so much to the fact that it's not about like these human brains we often associate, and this is getting to Andy Norman stuff. We often associate the human brain with this truth seeking thing or reason seeking thing. That's not it at all. It's the product of natural selection. It's seeking survival and reproduction.
Yeah.
And this is what I meant with my opening line of how identity shapes your perception. It's not about being true. It's about projecting that coalition correctly.
Yeah.
I'll give one example here. Let's say, let's say, for example, the flat Earth movement. Okay. So the flat Earth movement, there's this, have you seen the documentary, the Behind the Curve?
No.
It's actually really fantastic. It's all about the flat earther resurgence in the past several years. And there's this guy called Mark Sargent. He's kind of like the leader of the movement.
Tribal chief.
He's the tribal chief of the flat earthers. And there's a super candid moment at the end where they're asking him, the interviewers ask him, well, what would, if you tried to leave, like what would happen? And the guy, like his face basically went completely blank. You know, it's this moment where like the body language just kind of shut down. And he was like, I can't. Like they wouldn't let me. It's so, my group needs me so much. Like even if the earth was round, like
right. There's that pride.
There's the pride. There's the social identity. It's not about here's the thing. Flat earthism is not about whether or not the earth is flat or it's round. It's actually under the hood about a social community and a group to belong to. That's the driving force. And it's not about political truth. It's, fitness beats truth all the time. It'll always do it.
Yeah, and I like the concept that when you think about let's say people who are kind of more intellectual or more, let's say, educated. I like that. So the biggest predictor, I mean, we know obviously the biggest predictor is of let's say beliefs is not necessarily data or sort of the understanding of data, right? Even though you would think that obviously the more educated somebody is, it is somebody's tribal identity. So what's interesting is that there could be a correlation between let's say truth and accuracy. That's a better term. So there could be a correlation between beliefs and accuracy, whereas let's say if you identify as a Democrat, you're probably going to have more accuracy in your beliefs. But what's interesting is if you start going into it and start asking people, okay, but like, why do you think climate change is a problem, or why are you against abortion, right? Most of the time people don't really have answers. They don't even know, right? It's like, well, I mean, isn't that like what everybody believes?
It's just the feeling.
Yeah, well,
I'm not saying that, but that's kind of they won't be able to rationalize.
Well, it's why this is an intractable problem, because 9 out of 10 people, what they're saying, whether when they support or deny global warming, they're not really making an argument for or against global warming. They're saying I'm part of a tribe.
Yes.
That's what the signal is. So this was huge for me, realizing that actually this was rational. Because at first glance, you think, well, that's not rational. But no, the evolutionary logic is there. And it made me think of religion in a whole new light. I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian cult for all intents and purposes. And my father was a fundamentalist minister for 20 years. And so when I got out of that, I had a very stark, I would say, allergic reaction to most religion at scale. And that's maybe one of the reasons I'm an evolutionary anthropologist, because I needed another source of meaning or purpose. And what I realized here is that what the value proposition for most religions is, like, say, for example, the Holy Trinity. It actually plays with paradox and absurdity as a currency. So it's basically it's the fact that three things are one thing, that doesn't make sense.
Right.
But if you can authentically look someone in the eye and say, oh yeah, the Holy Trinity is real, and I believe it to my core, you're saying I'm an inveterate tribe member. Nothing will stop me from being a team player. Right. And that's the value prop. It's not the reality. So religions, tribes, intersubjective belief networks, they actually use absurdity as a currency to gain more members, or as a test, a litmus test for the members they have. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, the test aspect of it makes sense. Yeah. And I also like that you talk about the fact that, again, going back to the concept of being educated, that it's actually the people who are more educated are actually just better at rationalizing those beliefs. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So there's this idea that, and Andy and I have been talking about this a lot, like this idea of perhaps moving beyond this title of being a critical thinker might be a really good, valuable step. Because what happens is, first of all, when you say, I am part of the group of critical thinkers, you're saying you're part of a team, and it's corrupted your capacity to think already as a fundamental statement. And you have halo bias. So everybody thinks that, they have a privileged position on truth or understanding. And we know statistically, not like, there's just an average, right? So if 80% of people believe they have privileged truth, and it's just a bell curve, we know that most people are probably wrong. So this idea of some of the really interesting science coming out of here is a concept called numeracy. Have you guys talked at all with anybody about
Not
numeracy?
At all, actually.
No, but I know you wrote about it. So yeah, go ahead.
Awesome. Right on. Yeah. So this idea of numeracy is fascinating because of basically people what numeracy is, I'll define it. If you're numerate, you can look at a data set and you can correctly infer from what's going on by looking at the data set. Now, what they found, though, was that high numerate people, so it's highly educated, typically high IQ people, so there's a little bit of a genetic, there's a little bit of an education environment component to this.
Yep.
But high numerate people actually magnify bias, because when it's against their team, they are masterful at evading and then post hoc rationalizing the departure and the evasion. And when it's for them, they're super accurate at identifying the information that reaffirms their belief, more so than the less numerate group. So the less numerate groups are like imagine this much variation, right? The high numerate groups have this much variation.
Wow.
And so they're magnifying bias, they're not lessening bias. So I think the reason why Andy's work is so brilliant and why we should think about it deeply is because it's not necessarily about this having the title of a critical analysis, but it's about building mental immunity and resistance to bad ideas. And this is, I think, part of it. We can't let identity warp our perception and our capacity to tackle veridical truth, which I think is almost endemic, even in academia now, right? Like, if you identify, I'm an academic, I'm a critical thinker, literally, if you say that, I am less apt to listen to you. I would rather listen to somebody on the street over a beer, just talk about how they feel about something, than listen to that person talk about their ideology, because I'm about to get whooped with tribal ideology.
Right.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. Can I just make one quick distinction? What's what's so interesting is that if you look at critical thinker, what it actually usually means is liberal, and when you look at free thinker, it usually means libertarian conspiracy theorist. Go ahead.
Interesting. And so then would the solution to this then be the introduction of meta beliefs? And then what are meta beliefs?
Yeah, so I think meta beliefs are, I think, a really important part of the puzzle. That was one of the coolest things of coming across mental immunity and the concept is the recent science on what meta belief is. So meta belief is the belief that beliefs can change, right? And so I think maybe one way forward here, this is my swing for the fences solution for our species. I'll pitch it to you guys and see if you can disentangle what I'm trying to do here. So I have this idea of, if this is a tribe virus, if this is at scale, notwithstanding all the good stuff that can happen face to face if you really leverage group identities, because that's good stuff, and we should nurture that stuff. But when it's at scale, we need to protect ourselves from the worst parts of it. And if tribalism is the inherent view that my group is innately superior to other coalitionary alliances and other groups, if that's bad, here's one way to protect it. We have a vaccine that uses groupishness. And what I mean by groupishness is identity protective cognition. That is, as soon as you identify with a group, it's one of the biggest biases we've got, one of the most powerful and robust scientifically. As soon as you identify with a group, you are going to privilege information that supports the group, and you're going to eliminate information that goes against it. But what if we channel that energy for good? And so if a vaccine is two components, an adjuvant is the instruction giving protocol in a vaccine. And then the immunogen is like taking that active agent from the virus and using it so that the immune system understands it. What if we take that as identity protective cognition, and then we couple identity protective cognition with meta belief? So like basically we're saying, I am part of a meta tribe. I play for Team Human, and we believe at the systems level, at the species level, we believe as a group, leveraging that IPC, that beliefs can change. And that's one of, as Andy discovered, that's one of the most powerful ways to inoculate our minds from these kind of tribal vectors that are trying to manipulate our perception of reality. And so that's the pitch. That's the tribe vaccine.
Yeah, and what's so interesting? Did you want to say?
No, I just want to say I love that idea, by the way,
Awesome.
because honestly, how are you, at scale? How you know, a lot of people have thought about this. Like, how do you do it? Oh, do I make an amazing podcast that goes viral talking about critical thinking? Not enough people know about critical thinking, right? And then maybe you introduce like little nice ideas that spread virally. People think of things like that, right? But at scale, yeah, if you had a big, you know, sort of like a campaign, like a crowd-funded sort of campaign, right? Using like the best science available to us regarding advertising, and actually make this whole Team Human thing, like how you introduced in the last chapter. It actually sounds very, very hopeful, and I would love that.
What's the Socratic? It's a Socratic line of "I'm a citizen of the world."
Yes, and we don't. I'm under no illusions here. We're going to get 100%, you know, immunity. What we really need is sort of herd immunity, like enough, you know, you need to change a social norm or a value across a society. You need about 20 to 25%. It's about 25 to 28% of the people to buy into the new social norm. We call this the Overton window. It slides, right? For example, gay rights, like that was an Overton window. It seemed totally intractable and it would never happen for a long time. And then all of a sudden, like overnight it did. That's because it broke the 25% threshold. So these things are super, you know, identity is an illusion. So this is hopeful because it's not actually a real thing, right? And we haven't even talked about meditation, but like, you know, maybe in a metaphysical way as well, identity is not real. And if we can use it to leverage our capacity to see veridical truth and to bring down the temperature in the room on all this nasty weaponized political tribalism, I think it just increases the probabilistics of us being a successful species through the 21st century and beyond.
Yeah. And then so also I was thinking, what happens when, let's say, you have two conflicting loyalties? So what happens when you have, let's say, two tribes that you're a part of that in some ways conflict with one another? So I have an example that comes to mind. So one of our really good friends, like, so on the one hand, he would consider himself to be a Republican libertarian. So that's definitely not a tribe that I associate with. But then on the other hand, so he and I are pretty good friends. And then on top of that, like, we love professional wrestling together, right? So there's a sort of like a conflict, right? So we don't really focus on politics. We don't really talk about it much, you know, for good reason, obviously. But then it's like, but what happens when people feel like, so technically, by the way, that's a boundary that he and I have. I mean, we bring it up, but it's pretty cordial, so it's not an issue, right? But I was thinking in that kind of context, right? What happens when people aren't necessarily able to like compartmentalize those tribal loyalties? What happens when they do conflict? When on the one, let's say, you know, the family member, right? What happens when you have a family member who's like, I don't know, deeply involved in, you know, some, I'm going to just use conspiracy. So let's say he is a deeply involved like conspiracy theorist, and then you're like, oh my God, man, I love this guy, but he just keeps talking about this shit over and over again.
Yeah. At that point, you've got to use the science of identity to your advantage. So the best way to do that, and it's not like using it in a manipulative way. Actually, what you're doing a couple things. So you're elevating what you want to do with that, in this example of your really close friend, right? You want to, in the moments that you want to have where you communicate with them open and honestly, you want to elevate your shared identities. So emphasize like your identity as a wrestling fan, right? Elevate to his attention in that moment that you want to have a conversation perhaps about some greater or larger issue, because then that anterior cingulate cortex is going to light up like, oh yeah, we are wrestling fans and we are together on this. I'll give you a good example of this, and this is one of the coolest modern examples of tribal identity switching that I've come across. In 2011, May, Mets versus Phillies, one of the biggest rivalries in baseball. Like, it's nasty. Like, I think they might statistically have some of the highest frequency of getting out of the dugout and like beating the crap out of each other.
Wow.
Frequency for it's pretty intense. And around the sixth inning, and this was like a nail biter of a game. It was super close. There were some nasty things that happened in the opening innings, and around the sixth or seventh inning, the crowd started chanting USA.
Oh wow!
Over and over again, to the point where it was like everybody was like, "Well, what's going on?" and then it died down. Then it came back even bigger and longer and more pronounced in the next inning, and they had to like, what the hell was going on? They had just killed Osama bin Laden. They had just SEAL Team 6 had just got him. And if you look at the tenor of the rest of the game, like they ended up like hugging and embracing afterward. It was like this almost like in 1 second, they went from a distinct rivalry to superordinate identity.
Right.
And that superordinate identity became the most salient identity in that moment, even destroying the identities as rivals. A really epic historical example of this is Gettysburg in the Civil War. This was the nastiest, like 51,000 people died in one day. It was nasty. And it had been a long, protracted war. It was 1863. And one of the officers of the Confederacy, he did a picket line charge with his column, and he got hit with a bullet thrown off his horse, and he hit the ground. He's bleeding out. His lifeblood is bleeding out, and he extends his hand to the heavens, and he emits a signal, a very powerful tribal signal. I don't know what it is because it's a secret signal. And on the other side of a Union officer, his name was Hiram Bingham, picked up the Confederate officer and brought him to his field house, dressed his wounds, and as the guy was like dying out, promised to take his goods back to his family, which he fulfilled that obligation after the war. And it was 3 things. It was his spurs, his journal, and a Masonic necklace.
Wow.
And in that moment, so guys, this is, I think we can't understate this, because there is a magic to correctly tribal signaling. If you can have 2 enemies in a civil war who are literally fighting each other in a life or death situation, and then a signal changes that in 1 second from enemy to ally, that means that there's some magic in here we have to tap in the 21st century to survive as a species. We have to understand this trait.
Yeah, and by the way, speaking of symbols, the way that my friend and I would greet each other is with one of these. Yes,
nice.
The wolf pack. Yeah, the wolf pack symbol.
There you go, dude. That's it. Like, that's the power of symbols.
and what's so cool is that like anytime you see somebody in the street like with like a wrestling shirt, but particularly like an NWO shirt, you always go up to them and you flash one of these, and everybody knows what they're talking about.
I have a theory about, because I'm a metal fan. I love Metallica. I've seen Metallica like 5 times live. I write about them in the book. Yeah, big fan.
Yeah.
And so I love going to metal shows, and it's interesting. There's a cultural norm of whenever you go to the metal show, you don't wear the band t-shirt of the band that you're going to see, who's the main event. You always wear a different t-shirt. And I have a hypothesis about this, and I don't know if it's worth spending time testing.
Oh, it definitely is. No, I think it is. That sounds super interesting, because it's super like it's not intuitive.
It's not intuitive, because why I was like noting this, and after writing this book, I was like, oh, I have a hypothesis. I think it's because when you're emitting that signal, you're already in a kind of a super tribe of metal fan, but that's a very abstract. You're looking for real authentic relationships. So if you go to a super tribal event and you can hone in specifically, oh no, they're a fan of Mastodon. I'm going to buy this guy a beer and have a conversation with him, or buy this woman a beer and have a conversation with her. And you have this intersubjective belief network, a value system of symbols that can already bootstrap your cooperation. And we're always trying to seek out and find new members for a coalition, right? So that's my working hypothesis about why people go to metal shows and don't wear the front runners.
Oh, that's very cool. And by the way, this is, I mean, I'm not sure if you're a fan, but I'm going to assume that you are. So we're actually on the verge. I don't know how close this is. I'm assuming this is going to happen because it's been in the works for some time. We're actually at some point this year, I think we're going to have Wendy Dio on the show, Ronnie James Dio's wife. Are you a fan of his?
I'm familiar, but now that
Oh,
you mention
interesting.
it,
Oh,
yeah,
you
I'm gonna
would
check it
love
out.
Dio. Yeah, so I know obviously the original Black Sabbath.
Yes.
Yeah, so Dio was the replacement for Ozzy at the time, and then like so he kind of went off and did it. Yeah, he
Gotcha.
went.
Yeah,
So
no, no, no. Yeah, I'm
that,
familiar. I'm familiar.
you know the symbol, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Dio created that, by the way. There's a whole
That's
story
awesome.
behind. Yeah, so
I
that
did
was
not know that.
yeah, yeah. So his grandmother at the time, so I don't remember exactly the exact story, but it was like a symbol to, so it was an ancient, it was from like the Italian culture from like Sicily. It was a symbol like to ward off evil spirits. And Dio one
Nice.
day realized like, oh shit, that's like, it looks like the Moloch, right? So it looks like the devil symbol. So he threw it up at a show and he's like, the entire crowd threw it back at me. And that's how the symbol was born.
That's how the symbol was born,
Yeah.
and that's it created a greater strength symbolically to an intersubjective belief network, i.e., tribe. There we go.
Yeah.
Full circle.
Yeah.
Love it,
Yeah.
guys.
All right. So as we wrap up, Alan, any
Yeah.
final questions for David, or do
Oh,
you
wait.
want to?
So, okay. Actually, I mean, I do want to ask about trust building technologies
Actually, let's do that.
a little bit, just to kind of get into that. And what are some examples of those that are currently in development, like crypto, for example?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I'm stoked you asked that question. The cool. So I am not a fan of proof of stake. I don't know how familiar you guys are with proof of stake versus proof of work, but so these, I'll just roughly define these things. Proof of work is a ledger of record that needs to be tethered to the world with like actual like electricity, right? There's like a real work component. As where proof of stake, so proof of work, the example, the proof of concept of proof of work is Bitcoin. Where you have real mines tethered to real electricity, real watts. So it's in a way, it's a very real thing. As to where something like Ethereum, which now is proof of stake, meaning that your abstract god kings who run the code behind it can manipulate it at any time and change the backdoors, and it's the Ponzi schemes galore. So I'm anti proof of stake, big fan of proof of work, and if we can leverage this new technology that's coming out, DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, I'm seeing some really cool stuff with internet native tribes going on right now. When we talk about the tribes of the future, what is our tribal future? So one cool example is a group called Cabin. They're like think of them as a decentralized city. They have 22 neighborhoods spanning 4 continents, and they use DAO technology to democratize and also protect the constitution of their group, because if it's decentralized and it's on the blockchain, it's uncensorable. So you even the CCP can't, destroy their constitution or destroy their group, because it's this decentralized thing. And as long as the blockchain exists, they exist. So in a way, we talked about power projection at the very beginning of the show. The reason we kept scaling and scaling and scaling into these nation states is because of protection and security. But now in the 21st century, the things that we're valuing are much more disembodied things. There are things like even the money that we use now is it's on a credit card. It's this disembodied thing. It's
even attention. Attention is a
attention.
currency.
Exactly. So these things are disembodied, and we need technology to protect those things. Militaries protect hardware. They protect your physical property. But if we're beginning to value things that are in the digital world, we need a military to protect those things too. And that can allow people to assemble. This is a very libertarian idea, but like freedom of assembly, right? Like basically what I'm seeing now is it allows groups to come together in like a experimental sandbox of societies. And so that's why I'm super bullish about the more free parts of the world, in the economically developed world, that have these technologies, and also allowances in their constitutions to allow this freedom of assembly, because then you're going to get experiments going on of like new societies and new tribes. And if you can do one thing in particular, it's like Paleolithic democracy at its finest. If you can vote with your feet, then you are casting the ultimate vote. You are saying, I don't want to belong to this group anymore. I'm going to go to this group. And what's going to happen is over time, natural selection will create an arms race of these groups competing for citizens in these internet native tribes that become real tribes grounded in the real world using these technologies of trust. And what you'll see is an arms race of wellness, because if you can vote with your feet, you can go to the place that's going to enhance your life and the people that you care about most. And if you can leave the places that aren't fulfilling that obligation, they're going to die or they're going to adapt. And so you're going to get people competing for wellness enhancing societies. Wow. And that's why I'm actually super hopeful for our species. I think we've got a shot. And especially when we start leveraging what we do best, and that's technology.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess the thinking here is, evolutionarily speaking, on the one hand, it seems like a bad thing because, I mean, we haven't really evolved for let's say for truth seeking per se. I mean, yep. we say to ourselves that we have, but it's more like, no, we evolved to survive, and we want to survive, and we do so obviously by adapting the beliefs of our tribes. But I guess what you're saying is that we're also able to change the environment. So if we create like different types of tribes where truth seeking does become a higher value on the priority list. Yeah. So then what we're doing is we're saying, okay, cool, we can kind of have our cake and eat it too. On the one hand, we could have truth seeking, and on the other hand, we can have a tribe, let's say, cohesiveness.
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah, no, you perfectly articulated that. That's great. Yeah.
All right, excellent. Okay, so now as we wrap up, Alan, final questions for David before we go.
If we wanted to follow your work, and of course buy the book, where can we do that?
So on Twitter or X at Primal Primate, Instagram at Primal Primatologist. I've got a Substack that's in development right now. I've got a couple articles out. It's called the Tribe Drive Newsletter, and it's basically like the do-it-yourself of how to build your own camps, bands, and tribes for the 21st century. So if any of your listeners are like, I kind of want to move more towards a socially connected world for myself and for my family and for my kids, this is a do-it-yourself explanation of how to do that and leverage the science of applied evolutionary anthropology to that end.
Oh, awesome. And then what are the links for the Mental Immunity Project?
Yeah, so if you go to CIRCE and you type in mental immunity and CIRCE, you're going to find that project online and see the efforts that myself and Andy and his epic group of scientists that are working on the problem right now.
All right, excellent. Awesome. David, thank you so much for coming on, man. This is such a wonderful episode.
Yeah, it was fantastic, guys. As soon as you opened with the WWE reference, I was like, this is gonna be one of the fun ones. Like, we're gonna have fun in this podcast. It's not gonna be too stuffy, and I always love those.
Oh, and now I'm also curious, just before we wrap up, what's the show that you're going to? Which one?
The show?
The WWE show that you guys are going to. Is that a pay-per-view or just like a live show?
So that was the last one we went to was in Indianapolis. I want to say 2011.
Okay, so, wow.
Yeah. It's been a hot minute, but I've got a couple buddies who always keep me abreast of what's going on story arc wise. So I'm 1 degree separated from the active day-to-day of the WWE. Oh, you're talking about the actual show we're going to in September. So that's not a WWE show at all.
Oh, what is it?
It's literally a live Viking fighting event. So,
oh, wow.
So I'm myself and my group of best friends, our fire team, if you will. We are practitioners of a medieval martial art called SCA. So this is Society of Creative Anachronism. And basically you dress up in full plate armor, you have shields, you have rattan weapons, and you just beat like it's MMA, but it's multiple units and multiple groups fighting in big battles.
Wow.
Yeah, it's super fun. And it's a great exercise of the tribe drive.
Yeah.
At its finest with very few injuries.
Oh, wow. Wait, and just so I could be clear, and then your friend is training Roman Reigns for this for what?
Yeah, so that's for his particular. He's got a sub society, and that is a Viking. Like it's like a medieval martial art, but it's focused on Viking reenactment / fighting specifically. And so my buddy Kyle Potts, he's training the group in that particular style of fighting, so that when they go out and they play, they can play with as good as possible in terms of their martial prowess.
Okay, awesome. Wow, very cool.
Yeah, it's so much fun. It's a healthy way to exercise the tribe drive, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely the controlled environment. Okay, right. Thank you so much again, David, man. Again, this was excellent.
Take care.
My pleasure. All right, guys.
All right, talk to you soon, man.
For sure.
Bye.
All right. So, everyone, if you'd like to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On Twitter, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.